Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey really trying to explore everything we can find about cannabis.
Yeah, we're drawing from a really comprehensive Wikipedia entry and also a fascinating PBS NewsHour piece on the whole 420 holiday thing.
Right. And there is just a ton of information out there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Our goal, like always, is to kind of sift through all that noise and pull out the really important, the most, interesting bits for you.
Think of it as your shortcut, maybe. A guided tour to getting properly informed on cannabis without reading, well, everything yourself.
Exactly. And the sources, they cover so much ground.
They really do. We're talking history, uses medical, recreational, even spiritual.
How it's consumed, the effects short-term, long-term.
The pharmacology, the chemistry, all the different varieties and, preparations.
And then there's the legality, economics, culture.
And that whole 420 story, which is pretty wild. So yeah, let's dive in and try to unpack all of this.
Okay, let's start with the basics. The names. People call it so many things, right? Marijuana, weed, pot, ganja.
Yeah, the list goes on. And sometimes those names tell you a bit about, the culture or the time period it came from.
And scientifically, what are we actually talking about?
Well, mainly three species. Cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, and then there's cannabis ruderalis.
Right, and that last one, ruderalis, it's not really used recreationally much, is it?
No, apparently it's got really low levels of THC, the main psychoactive compound we'll be talking about quite a bit.
Makes sense. And the word cannabis itself, where's that from?
It's got a deep history, believed to come from the Scythians, those ancient nomadic folks.
And the Greeks picked it up from them, apparently, after seeing them use it in funerals, which is kind of fascinating.
It really shows how long this plant's been tangled up with humans, way before its recent, surge in popularity.
It really does. And you see it in other old languages, too, like Akkadian, Kunubu.
In Hebrew, Kami Bosim. It just hammers home how far back this relationship goes.
So, geographically, it originated somewhere in Central or South Asia.
That's the thinking. And when people use it, they're usually using the flower and the fruit parts of the plant.
Okay, so how have people actually used it? Let's maybe start with the medical side. That seems to generate a lot of talk and maybe some confusion.
Yeah, what is medical cannabis exactly? It seems like there isn't one single definition everyone agrees on.
That's a key point. Sometimes it means the whole plant, unprocessed, or just extracts.
But other times it includes specific cannabinoids taken from the plant or even synthetic ones.
Exactly. And researching it properly has been tricky, because of legal restrictions and how it's classified in a lot of places.
Right, hurdles in the way of science. But despite that, there is some evidence emerging for medical uses, isn't there?
There is. What does the research show promise for?
Well, studies suggest it can help reduce nausea and vomiting, especially for chemotherapy patients.
Okay, that's significant.
And improving appetite for people with HIV/AIDS, also alleviating chronic pain and muscle spasms.
What kind of pain or spasms?
Things like neuropathic pain and some symptoms linked to multiple sclerosis seem to respond well, according to some studies.
And what about other conditions people often mention, like glaucoma or epilepsy?
The evidence there is considered less strong. Same for things like AIDS wasting syndrome or rheumatoid arthritis.
So it's important to distinguish, right, where the science seems pretty solid versus where maybe more research is really needed.
Definitely. It shows where it might genuinely help and where we still need to, figure things out.
And where can people actually get medical cannabis legally, assuming they have a prescription?
Well, quite a few places now. Canada, Belgium, Australia, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Spain.
And a lot of U.S. states, right?
Yeah, many U.S. states, too. Though the rules on how it works, distribution and stuff, they vary quite a bit depending on local laws.
Okay, let's shift gears then. Recreational use. It's definitely become more common, more visible.
Absolutely. And there was that quote in the source material from a DEA judge, Francis Young.
Oh, yeah. Calling cannabis one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. That's quite something.
It really is. So when people use it recreationally, what are they generally looking for? The high, right?
That's usually the goal, yeah. But that feeling, the high, it's subjective. It can feel really different depending on the person.
Like their past experience matters.
Yeah.
And the type of cannabis.
Exactly. Those factors play a big role.
So what are the typical effects you might expect, say, if you smoke it?
Well, euphoria often kicks in pretty quickly, within minutes usually.
Okay.
And then you get other common short-term things. Changes in perception, mood shifts, heart rate goes up.
The famous munchies, right? Increased appetite.
Definitely. And also temporary issues with short-term memory, working memory, and psychomotor coordination. So not great for complex tasks.
But people report other effects they actually want too, beyond just euphoria.
Oh, yeah. Relaxation is a big one. Altered perception, feeling more aware of senses, sometimes increased libido, and that sense of time or space feeling different, distorted even.
And what happens if someone takes, like, a much higher dose?
Well, that's when you might get more intense effects. Things like altered body image, illusions like misinterpreting things you actually see or hear.
Okay.
Pseudo-hallucinations, which feel real but aren't quite full hallucinations. Maybe ataxia that's lack of muscle control or even dissociative states.
Dissociate, like what?
Like depersonalization, feeling detached from yourself, or derealization, where the world around you feels kind of unreal or foggy.
The sources also mention spiritual use, which maybe isn't talked about as much in, like, mainstream discussions.
Right. The Rastafari movement is probably the most well-known example in modern times. For them, it's a sacrament,
Right.
an aid for meditation.
Interesting. Okay, let's get practical. How do people actually consume it? The methods.
Well, first off, heat is usually key for most methods. There's this process, decarboxylation.
Ah, yes, turning the THCA into THC, the non-psychoactive stuff into the active stuff.
Exactly. Heat is kind of like the ignition key to make it work psychoactively.
Got it. So, assuming heat's involved or accounted for, what are the main ways?
Smoking is obviously a big one. Using pipes, bonds, those water pipes, joints, blunts.
Blunts are rolled in tobacco leaf, right?
Yeah, or tobacco paper wraps. Then there's vaporizing, which has gotten really popular.
How does that work?
You heat the cannabis, but not enough to burn it. Usually somewhere between, say, 165 and 190 Celsius. It releases a vapor with the cannabinoids, but without the smoke.
And edibles, they seem to be everywhere now.
They really are. Cannabis can be put into, well, almost anything food-wise. Butter, oils for cooking, baked goods, candies, drinks.
Like Bang in India, that traditional drink.
Exactly. And cannabis tea is a thing too, but THC doesn't dissolve well in water.
Ah, so you need fat, like milk or butter.
Precisely, to help extract the good stuff.
What about liquids other than tea?
You've got tinctures. They're usually alcohol-based extracts, sometimes called green dragon. You take them orally, small doses. And then cannabis oils, which are really concentrated. People might vape those or take them orally. And capsules filled with oil are available too.
Yeah.
Canada approved a whole bunch back in 2018, apparently.
The Wikipedia source had some stats on usage in the U.S. What did that show?
Yeah, surveys around 2018 suggested almost half of U.S. adults had tried it at some point. A fair chunk had used it in the past year or even month.
And college students.
Interestingly, by 2014, daily use among U.S. college students had its highest point since 1980. It actually surpassed daily cigarette smoking in that group back then. That's a pretty big shift.
Wow. Who's using it more in the U.S., generally?
Men are more than twice as likely as women, apparently. And younger adults, 18 to 29, use it way more than folks over 65.
And overall lifetime use.
A 2015 poll had it at 44% of the U.S. population saying they tried it. That was a record at the time.
How does U.S. use compare globally?
It's about 3 times the world average, roughly.
Yeah.
But pretty similar to other Western democracies, actually.
And when do people typically first try it in the U.S.?
Around age 16 is typical. Similar to alcohol, but earlier than most other illicit drugs.
And that recent Gallup poll finding.
Yeah, 2022. For the first time, more Americans said they smoked marijuana than cigarettes. Another significant milestone, really.
Okay, let's switch to a more serious topic. The potential downsides, the adverse effects. Starting with the short-term ones. What immediate negatives might someone feel?
Well, anxiety and panic can happen. Attention and memory can definitely be impaired.
And psychotic symptoms.
Yeah, there's an increased risk of experiencing those temporarily. Just general unclear thinking, too. And importantly, a higher risk of accidents.
Especially driving, right? That seems like a major concern.
It really is. Cannabis definitely impairs driving. THC is found pretty often in drivers involved in crashes.
And they're more likely to be at fault.
Several times more likely, yeah, compared to someone sober. But pinning down direct cause and effect is tricky, because THC can stay in your system for days, even weeks, after the actual impairment wears off. So just finding it doesn't automatically mean someone was high at the time of the crash. It's debated.
Okay. What about other immediate, maybe less severe, but still unpleasant side effects?
Things like decreased short-term memory, definitely dry mouth, motor skills being off, red eyes.
Busyness, tiredness.
Yeah, those two. And some people experience nausea or even vomiting.
And acute psychosis. You mentioned psychotic symptoms.
Right. In some cases, especially with high doses, someone might have a brief episode of acute psychosis. It usually clears up within hours. but very rarely it can last longer.
The sources also mentioned risks for kids.
Yes, that's a growing concern, especially with edibles becoming more common and, legal. Accidental exposure in children is up,
And that can be serious for them.
potentially very serious. Things like encephalopathy, low blood pressure, breathing problems, extreme drowsiness, even coma. The exact toxic dose isn't perfectly known, but the risk is real.
Let's talk about fatalities. Is there a clear link between cannabis and death?
Well, direct proof linking it to cardiovascular deaths in big studies is lacking, but a 2019 review suggested it might be an underreported factor sometimes because it can put strain on the heart, maybe contributing to sudden deaths in some cases.
And that hyperemesis.
Yeah, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. There have been deaths linked to complications from that severe vomiting. We'll get into CHS more later.
What about suicide?
There's an observed association between cannabis use and suicide, especially in younger people. But again, whether it's a cause isn't established, it's an association.
Have there been specific deaths attributed directly to cannabis toxicity?
One survey mentioned a single adult death in Oregon and Alaska ERs chalked up to acute cannabis toxicity.
Okay, one case. But what about that more recent study, the 2025 one?
Oh, right. That study indicated that having cannabis use disorder, basically, addiction was linked to a nearly threefold higher death rate over 5 years.
Threefold. Wow.
Yeah, and a tenfold higher suicide risk, plus higher risk of death from trauma, poisoning, and lung cancer.
And the Canadian research post-legalization.
They saw a rise in schizophrenia and psychosis cases linked specifically to cannabis use disorder after they legalized. So, serious potential consequences, especially with heavy dependent use.
That brings us to long-term effects. What are the main concerns there?
It's still an area where not everything is crystal clear, but the big worries are impacts on memory and thinking, the risk of addiction, obviously, and that potential link to schizophrenia, particularly for young people whose brains are still developing.
And quality of life.
Some studies link heavy long-term use to lower quality of life, but it's not clear which causes which, And the link seems weaker than what you see with tobacco, for instance.
What about actual physical changes in the brain? Can we see anything with scans?
Neuroimaging hasn't consistently found, widespread damage to the main brain structures, the white and gray matter.
There's usually a but.
But yeah, reduced volume in the hippocampus that's key for memory seems to be a fairly consistent finding.
Okay.
The amygdala, involved in emotions, shows up as abnormal in some studies, but it's inconsistent.
Anything else?
Some research suggests the brains of users might work harder, recruit more areas for tasks, maybe as compensation. And those CB1 receptors we mentioned, they get downregulated with chronic use, but that seems to reverse if someone stops using. There's also some limited evidence about changes in glutamate levels.
Addiction or cannabis use disorder is a key concern. How common is it?
Estimates vary, but based on older criteria, maybe around 9% of people who try it might become dependent.
And for daily users?
A 2013 review put that figure higher, maybe 10 to 20% dependence rate among daily users.
Are there risk factors, things that make someone more likely to become dependent?
Yeah, things like doing poorly in school, behavioral issues as a kid or teen, being rebellious, having bad relationships with parents, or having parents with their own substance abuse history.
And if someone is dependent and stops, what's withdrawal like?
About half of daily users report withdrawal symptoms. Things like sleep trouble, irritability, feeling down or uneasy dysphoria, and craving cannabis.
How does it compare to, say, alcohol withdrawal?
It's generally considered less severe than alcohol withdrawal.
And the official diagnosis now? DSMV.
Right, cannabis use disorder. It affects about 9% of those exposed. The criteria include craving, but they took out the old criterion about legal problems.
How does that 9% compare to other drugs?
It's lower than cocaine, which is around 20%, alcohol around 23%, and way lower than nicotine, which is up near 68% of those exposed developing dependence.
The connection between cannabis and psychiatric problems is, complicated and debated, right?
Very much so. There are kind of two main schools of thought, or maybe two types of concern.
Okay, what are they?
One is about those temporary psychotic reactions, acute cannabis-associated psychotic symptoms, or CIPS, short episodes linked closely to use.
And the other?
Is the worry about potentially triggering or worsening longer-lasting disorders that look like schizophrenia?
What's the evidence for that link to psychosis or schizophrenia?
Well, population studies show a clear dose-response relationship, meaning the more heavily someone uses cannabis, the higher their risk seems to be for psychosis. And it might start earlier, too.
But does that prove cannabis causes it?
No, that causal link is still debated and hard to prove definitively. It's a strong association, but causation is trickier.
What about depression or anxiety?
There's some suggestion of increased risk there too, but again, the research isn't really strong enough yet to say for sure if cannabis causes them.
Let's talk about physical health effects beyond the brain. That cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, CHS.
Right. That's a nasty one for some chronic, heavy users. It involves cycles of really severe, uncontrollable vomiting, sometimes lasting a day or two.
And people have actually died from it.
Tragically, yes. A few deaths have been reported due to complications arising from it.
What about the lungs and breathing, especially with smoking?
Chronic heavy smoking is linked to more respiratory infections, coughing, producing sputum, wheezing basically, symptoms of chronic bronchitis.
Does it cause COPD, like tobacco?
A direct causal link to COPD hasn't been proven, unlike with tobacco. Interestingly, in the short term, cannabis can actually act as a bronchodilator, opening the airways a bit.
And the heart, cardiovascular risks.
There's concern, yeah. But as of 2018, the relationship was still murky. It's complicated because people often use cannabis with tobacco or other drugs that definitely affect the heart.
But is there any known immediate risk?
Yes. Studies show a higher risk of having a heart attack in the hour right after smoking cannabis.
Anything else physical? Drug interactions?
There's some early evidence it might interfere with blood thinners, anticoagulant drugs. And as for those anti-inflammatory or pain-relieving effects people talk about, the exact ways those might work weren't fully defined. And there weren't any government approvals for it as a drug for those things, at least as of 2019.
What about emergency room visits? Are more people ending up in the ER because of cannabis?
It seems so. ER admissions linked to cannabis went up noticeably between 2012 and 2016. Teenagers seem to be at the highest risk.
Any specific data? Like from Colorado after they legalized?
Yeah, one hospital there found about 2% of their ER visits involved cannabis users. And in about a quarter of those cases, cannabis was thought to be at least partly to blame for why they were there. Often other drugs were involved too, though.
What were the main reasons people came in related to cannabis?
Acute psychiatric problems and stomach issues, like that CHS vomiting syndrome, were common.
And national U.S. data.
Back in 2011, the government tracked about 455,000 ER visits associated with cannabis use. Now, associated doesn't always mean cannabis was a direct cause. Many involved other drugs. But in about 129,000 of those visits, cannabis was the only drug implicated. So it's definitely a factor in ER visits.
Okay, let's shift now to the pharmacology. How does cannabis actually work in the body chemically?
Right, so the main player, THC, that's delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, it acts on specific receptors in our body, primarily the CB1 receptors. It's a weak partial agonist there.
And CBD.
Cannabidiol.
CBD is different. It acts as an antagonist at those same CB1 receptors. Think of them like locks. THC is a key that fits partially and turns the lock a bit. CBD kind of blocks the lock or changes how other keys work.
Where are these locks, these receptors?
CB1 receptors are mostly in the brain and central nervous system, but also some in other tissues. CB2 receptors are found mainly outside the brain, like on immune cells, but also on some brain cells too.
And THC messing with CB1 is what causes the mood and thinking changes.
That's the main theory. It affects signaling inside the cells, like inhibiting an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. It also indirectly causes more dopamine to be released, which likely contributes to the psychoactive effects.
What about other interactions, like with opioid or glycine receptors?
CBD does interact with opioid receptors, acts as an allosteric modulator, and THC can boost glycine receptors, but how much these other actions actually contribute to the overall feeling or effects of cannabis, that's still kind of unknown, really.
How does the body handle these cannabinoids? How long do they stick around? They're very lipophilic fat-loving, so they get stored easily in body fat.
Which means they last a long time.
A very long time. Detectable levels of THC can hang around for weeks after just a single use, depending on how much was used and how sensitive the test is.
Does that long persistence matter for the effects?
Some researchers think so. They suggest that maybe this buildup in the fatty membranes of nerve cells could be important for understanding marijuana's effects, especially the longer-term ones.
Okay, let's look at the chemistry of cannabis itself. What's in the plant?
It's incredibly complex. Around 483 known compounds identified. That includes at least 65 different cannabinoids.
Like THC, CBD,
And CBN, cannabinol, are the big ones people usually talk about and study.
and detecting these in the body. For drug tests or investigations?
Yeah, you can measure THC and its main metabolite, THC-CC-OH, in pretty much any body fluid, blood, urine, hair, saliva, sweat.
What do those tests tell you?
Usually done with sophisticated lab techniques like GCMS or LCMS. They can indicate if someone used recently, roughly when, maybe how much or how often.
But they can't tell why someone used it, like medical versus recreational.
No, the tests can't distinguish the reason for use.
Are the quick screening tests reliable? Immunoassays.
They're often used first because they're faster and cheaper, but they can sometimes react to different cannabinoids, so they're not perfectly specific. You usually need lab confirmation.
Where do you find THC versus the metabolite?
Urine mostly has the metabolite, THC, COHH, but hair, saliva, and sweat tend to have more of the parent THC. Blood can have both.
What about those field tests police might use, the Duquesnoy-Levine test?
That's a color test used for screening, but it's not definitive. It can give false positives with other plants, so it always needs lab backup.
And that rumor about zinc supplements masking THC in urine tests.
The research on that is actually conflicting. It's not clear if it really works.
Let's talk varieties and strains. What makes them different? Potency.
Generally, yeah, THC content is the main measure of potency people look at.
And how much THC is typical in different products?
Well, the dried flower or bud often hovers around 5%, maybe more these days. Resin, like hashish, can be much stronger, maybe up to 20% THC.
And oils?
Oils can be really potent, sometimes over 60% THC.
Has potency changed over time? Is weed stronger now?
Generally, yes. Studies show illicit cannabis potency has mostly increased since the 70s. Higher THC levels, often lower CBD levels.
Does that mean people consume more THC overall?
It's not totally clear. Users might adjust how much they use based on the strength. But higher potency probably means you can inhale less smoke, less tar to get the same effect.
Why did CBD levels drop?
Probably a mix of things. Breeding focused on maximizing THC, and maybe the rise of indoor growing. Easier to hide, but maybe not the best environment for CBD production.
And the black market risks. Laced cannabis.
That's a real concern, yeah. Cannabis laced with other substances, or synthetic cannabinoids, which can be very dangerous, are risks you might face on the unregulated market.
The source listed different preparations. Can we quickly run through those?
Sure. Marijuana is the basic dried flower and leaves. Keef is the powdery resin glands, shaken or sifted off.
Hashish?
That's the keef, the resin, pressed together, usually into a block or ball. More concentrated.
Tincture.
A liquid extract, usually made with alcohol.
Hash oil.
A very concentrated, oily resin extracted, using solvents.
Infusions.
That's steeping cannabis in something, usually fatty like butter or oil, to pull out the cannabinoids for edibles.
And marijuana prensada.
That's brickweed. Cannabis compressed really tightly, often lower quality, more stems and seeds.
Let's zoom out to history and law. How far back does cannabis cultivation go?
A long way back, at least the 3rd millennium BCE for cultivation.
And smoking it for psychoactive effects.
We have evidence from the Pamir Mountains around 500 BCE, so people have been getting high from it for at least 2,500 years.
When did the laws against it start?
Some restrictions popped up as early as the 14th century, but the big wave of making it illegal in most countries really happened in the 20th century, driven by international treaties and changing drug policies.
But now the tide is turning, somewhat. Where is recreational use actually legal?
Uruguay was the first, back in 2013. Canada followed in 2018.
Who else?
Georgia and South Africa have court rulings allowing use, but not really sales. Germany just legalized in April 2024. Luxembourg, Malta, Thailand.
And the U.S.
Federally illegal still. But 24 states, 3 territories, and D.C. have legalized it for recreational use under their own state laws. Australia only has it legal in the ACT.
Let's explore that intersection of culture, law, and economics a bit more. Culturally, how significant is cannabis now?
It's huge. One of the most used psychoactive drugs in the world since the late 20th century. Really only behind tobacco and alcohol.
An anthropologist, Vera Rubin, had an interesting take.
Yeah, she talked about 2 cultural streams. A traditional one, sacred or everyday use, small-scale growing for different needs. And a contemporary one linked more to commercial hemp and that search for psychedelic experiences, kind of like historical groups, the Club des Hashish in Paris.
Legally, can you summarize the global picture again? It seems complex.
It is. Most countries banned it in the 20th century, but now many are softening penalties for small amounts fines instead of jail.
And that potential U.S. federal change.
Right. The plan announced in April 2024 to maybe move it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. That could be a big deal.
So, recapping legalization. Uruguay, Canada, Germany are key examples of full national legalization, right?
As of 2022, Uruguay and Canada were really the only ones with full, nationwide regulated systems for recreational use, production, sale, everything. Germany's system is still new.
And the U.S. patchwork.
Yeah, many states legal, federally illegal.
Right.
Georgia and South Africa legalized use via courts, but not really sales. Spain and the Netherlands have tolerance policies, especially for personal use and licensed cafes, but it's not fully legal in the Netherlands, just decriminalized.
Malta, Estonia, Lebanon.
Malta was the first EU country to legalize recreational use. Estonia allows sales of very low THC products. And Lebanon became the first Arab nation to legalize growing it just for medical use.
What about the economics? Did the sources say much?
Only briefly mentioned production and price as factors. Didn't really dive deep into market size, jobs, revenue, that whole burgeoning industry. It's a huge topic, just not detailed in these particular sources.
Okay, the gateway drug theory. That's been around forever. What do the sources say?
Well, the theory is that using cannabis leads to using harder drugs. Part of that could just be social. If it's illegal, you might encounter people selling other illegal drugs.
Some people say alcohol and tobacco are gateways too, right? Just because they're often tried earlier.
Exactly. Or there's the common liability idea. Maybe some people are just more prone to trying any substance, and cannabis, alcohol, tobacco are just the ones that are easier to get first.
So seeing a sequence doesn't automatically mean one caused the other.
Right. Experts warn against jumping to that conclusion. It oversimplifies things and might get in the way of good research or helping people.
But wasn't there an NES study suggesting a link?
Yes, a 2020 NIDA study did find that marijuana use is likely to precede other drug use for some people.
Yeah.
And linked it to higher risks for alcohol problems and other substance use disorders, including nicotine addiction.
But not for everyone.
Crucially, no. The vast majority of marijuana users don't go on to use harder drugs. And again, alcohol and nicotine also prime the brain and are usually used first. So it's complex. There's an association for some, but it's not a guaranteed pathway.
Okay, let's finish with the 420 story from that PBS article. The origins used to be pretty murky, right? Lots of myths.
Totally. People thought it was a police code or linked to a Bob Dylan song, all sorts of stuff. But the real story, the consensus now, points to a group of high school kids in California.
Santa Fe High, 1971. The Waldos. Tell us about them.
So the story goes they got a map from a friend's older brother to a hidden cannabis patch out near Point Reyes. The brother couldn't tend it anymore.
And they decided to go look for it.
Exactly. In the fall of '71, these 5 friends or so made a plan. They'd meet after school and football practice at 4:20 p.m. by the Louis Pasteur statue on campus.
Why 4.20?
It's just when they were both free. They'd smoke a bit, then head out treasure hunting.
Did they ever find the patch?
Hilariously, no. They never found it. But 4.20 Louis, later just 420, became their secret code for, meeting up to smoke or go searching. Their inside joke.
And they kept proof.
They did. They were smart. Saved letters, other stuff from the 70s with 420 written on it, even put it in a bank vault.
Wow.
And when the Oxford English Dictionary added 420 in 2017, they cited some of those Waldo documents as early evidence.
So how did this high school slang go global?
The Grateful Dead seems to be the key connection. One Waldo's brother managed a Deadside band, and another Waldo's dad handled real estate for them. They started hanging out in the Dead scene.
So it spread through the Deadhead network.
Seems likely. Phil Lesh, the bassist, has confirmed the connection. Then, fast forward to the early 90s.
What happened then?
Steve Bloom, a reporter for High Times magazine, was at a Dead show and got handed a flyer.
What did the flyer say?
It basically urged people to meet up at 420 on 420 for 420ing in Marin County. High Times published the flyer.
And that blew it up.
That seems to have really pushed it into the mainstream cannabis culture.
It's amazing how things like that catch on. One of the Waldos commented on that.
Yeah, Waldo Steve Capper said it was a phenomenon.
Yeah.
Most slang dies out, but 420 just kept going and growing.
But we don't know who made that pivotal flyer.
Nope. The creators of the flyer that really cemented the date remain anonymous, apparently.
So how do people celebrate 420 now?
Well, usually by consuming cannabis. Big gatherings happen, like at Hippie Hill in San Francisco. Lots of local events too, movie nights showing Cheech and Chong, pottery parties to make pipes.
Dispensary sales, festivals.
Yeah. Big sales at pot shops, music festivals themed around it. Even breweries get in on it with 420 beers like Sweetwater or Lagunitas Waldo Special Ale.
But there's a political side to it too, isn't there? A day for activism.
Definitely. It's become a day for activists to measure progress on legalization and push for more change.
Progress has been mixed, especially federally in the U.S.
Right. Lots of states have legalized recreationally, even more medically, but federal progress is slow. Congress can't even agree on things like letting cannabis businesses use banks or take tax deductions like normal businesses.
What about recent federal actions? Biden's pardons.
Yeah, Biden issued pardons for federal simple possession offenses, urged governors to do the same, and the Justice Department is reviewing federal policy, that potential rescheduling move we mentioned.
And the Attorney General's stance. Cole memo.
Garland indicated he'd stick to something like the old Cole memo policy, basically. Feds back off if states regulate well and don't interfere with key federal priorities, though the Trump administration had gotten rid of that memo earlier.
What are activists pushing for now, federally?
The big pushes are for descheduling cannabis entirely at the federal level and really addressing the harms caused by the war on drugs, especially in minority communities. Things like ending the denial of federal benefits or stopping deportations just because of a state marijuana conviction.
So, wow, we've covered a huge amount today, an incredible deep dive.
We really have, from the plant's ancient history, all its uses, the effects, the chemistry.
The complex legal situation, the culture, and that whole amazing 420 origin story.
Yeah, hopefully this gives everyone a really solid, comprehensive overview based on what's in those sources.
Definitely. Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Given everything we've unpacked, the long history, the patchwork of laws, the ongoing research into risks and benefits, what does all this suggest to you about where cannabis is headed in society?
Yeah, what parts of this really stood out to you? What makes you want to maybe dig a little deeper on your own?
It's a lot to think about. We encourage you to mull it over, reflect on the information, and maybe follow up on whatever sparked your interest.